I mean, Professor Lampton, this surely isn't unique in the world today. Of course, you have China and the United States, the two leading global economies. But if you look at the world as a whole, mistrust, as Ambassador said just there, in our governments, in our institutions, has become something of the norm rather than the exception. So should we be alarmed by what we are seeing? Or should we take a step back and say, well, that's just part of a larger trend that we're seeing evolve at this time?
Well, I do think there are global trends, and then there are the trends in our bilateral relationship. And I think there is a global trend towards more populist leaders around the world, people who try to build strongman political positions by speaking to the grievances of those left behind by globalization. I firmly believe that globalization improves the livelihood of people around the world. Probably 80, 85, 90% of the people are better off. But in each of our societies, there are people who have been left behind, and certainly people who think they were entitled to do better, and they have grievances. And now around the world, we have leaders in each of our societies that plays to these grievances of various sorts, including a rising power such as China that believes the United States is not moving rapidly enough to make room for China in the international system, or worse yet, even desires to slow China's growth and development down. So I think these are, global trends that are also reflected in U.S.-China relations. The reality is that for about 3+ years, we virtually had no what we might call system-wide dialogues on an ongoing basis. And now we don't have those avenues of dialogue, and I think we need to develop them. So that'd be the first thing. Secondly, I think this issue of decoupling. Quite frankly, yes, there are a lot of Americans who, incidentally, probably don't know much about economics that talk about decoupling. And certainly the COVID pandemic raises the issue of reliance on other countries to provide you needed commodities such as antibiotics or personal protective equipment. And also, as Ambassador Hu said, in the security area, high technologies become sensitive. But the point I want to make is it's not just the United States making this point. Well, you hear that in China too, because as we become less trustful of each other, we're each less willing to rely on the other for essential inputs into our economic or strategic systems. So I would say this decoupling there are people thinking this way in both societies. And so I think we're moving away from what I'd call law number one in economics, which is comparative advantage, free trade, or at least freer trade, and everybody doing what they do best in order to serve maximum welfare of everybody. Those are the kind of principles. Now, they weren't always faithfully observed either by China or us, but at least they were a more shared goal. And so I think we need to get back to what I might call globalization 2.0, and that is, don't throw out comparative advantage. Don't throw out the idea that we each need each other, but let's make globalization more friendly to that 20% of the populations in our countries or around the world that were losers in globalization 1.0. So frankly, I don't think much is going to change until we have leaders who think differently. And that's I think, the core.
I mean, we look back 40 plus years ago, ostensibly what we had were a group of people who were able to look far into the future and were also able to agree to disagree on certain points. If we look now at this declining bilateral relationship. We've got the trade tensions, we've got the tech battles. It's impacting people-to-people exchanges. There's been a blame game over the pandemic. Is it possible to manage this talk of a broader decoupling? Is it possible to forestall that decline?
Well, James, I think you're right. We need to look forward. Several points to make. One is Professor Lampton mentioned the less of talks in the last 3.5 years. I also noticed that not too much talk, systemic talks between the two major powers. We need to restore that. But my worry, my concern is that U.S. administration, Trump administration in particular, since he took power, there was less enthusiasm on the part of the United States to engage in systemic talk with China. So we need to start that. If we can jumpstart that will be okay. Secondly, about globalization, I agree with Professor Lampton, with David, that globalization has changed. There is a critical balance, very difficult to manage, both for China and for the United States. That is, globalization 1.0 has produced lots of wealth, but the distribution of benefits was uneven. You do produce groups of people that lags behind others, especially people in finance, in high tech, lag behind. Their income are either stagnating or decreasing. So they're unhappy, they are angry, and these are the people behind the populist movements. So globalization 2.0 is absolutely necessary, but the key is not to totally negate saying, all those angers should go away. And they will not go away. You see the riots in the United States. You see, turbulences elsewhere in other countries. They are expression of the people. Maybe not in the wrong way, and maybe not in the right way, but they are the real expression of anger, uncertainty, insecurity at the social fabric, social arrangement. So we need to look closely and see what to do to maintain a balance between globalization continuing, no free trade, etc., and also a kind of social justice, social fairness that would distribute the benefits of globalization more evenly. Lastly, concerning the relocation of global supply chain, David talked about COVID-19, over-reliances on medical supplies from China, and China talking about self-reliance. We are at a critical moment now, again, because of COVID-19. And, look at China. Take China, for instance. China has been faced with a tech embargo, basically, from the United States. That is the backdrop against which you have to view China's, saying we have to be self-reliant in certain areas because we couldn't get it elsewhere. But I do not believe self-reliance is a negation of globalization. China is in full support of further globalization because China's progress so far is a product of globalization, not the other way around.
Are there ways where halfway points can be established?
Our politicians have to recalibrate the distribution of benefits within their societies, but they also have to try to level the playing field that wasn't so level before for good reason. Not all of the parties were economically equal. So I think it's a very difficult task. And just I would say one other thing It's not just the globalization and economic circumstance that's changed, both within and between societies. It is basically our strategic posture. I would say for the preceding 40 years, the United States and China basically tried to reassure each other. Sometimes we didn't succeed at that. Sometimes we failed. Sometimes we had crises. But the overall trend was to convince each other that as we each got stronger, we did not represent a threat to each other. I think that basic effort has broken down. And what we are now both doing strategically is organizing ourselves for deterrence. And what deterrence means is threaten the other so they don't do what you don't want them to do. That's the core. And as long as you build a relationship on threat, it's going to be very difficult to reassure. So I think we need in both societies and both leaderships a change in our strategic orientation back to a posture of at least more reassurance, even though we will not get all the way back to where we were, I'm sure. You never can go home. But the long and the short of it is we need to reorient ourselves on how we create more fairness between countries and within countries. And we need to at least have more reassurance and less threat.
Okay, I have a few points in response to what Professor said about the fairness between countries, among countries. I agree. We need to have level playing field when we compete, economically or otherwise. But level playing fields has to be two-way traffic. Secondly, I also agree with you that strategic assessment, strategic judgment is extremely important. And in the past, personally, I led negotiation on Chinese part, on part of China during Obama's visit in 2009 to China. We issued a joint communique. We managed to agree on many things and managed to disagree also a few things. But the important thing is that we do agree that China and the United States should strive to build a forward-looking, comprehensive partnership. We haven't put our bar very high. We're just saying we need to cooperate and form a kind of partnership that would be fair, benefiting both sides. Unfortunately, that fall by wayside when President Trump took office. We need to restore. We need to seriously engage in strategic dialogue to make sure there will be no, either you die or I die, that kind of thing in the strategic competition.